Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to be allowed to speak.
I recognize the senator from California.
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent to be allowed to speak for 9 minutes and Senator Schumer for 2 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, today's vote will determine how much methane polluters are allowed to belch into the air. It will determine how many asthma attacks Americans suffer. It will determine how many Americans will die because we relax the standards on how much methane oil and gas companies are allowed to leak into the air that we breathe. On July 31st of this year, the EPA decided to delay the enforcement of the agency's own standards for methane pollution from oil and gas companies. For those who aren't aware, methane is a super pollutant. When it comes to making our air dirtier or contributing to climate change, it is 80 times worse than carbon dioxide. EPA itself estimates that their new rule, or more accurately, their new license to pollute, will pump 3.8 million tons of methane into our air, about the same amount as if we put 66 million more cars on the road. It's really staggering when you think of it. By the EPA's new rule, the rule that we are right now, through my resolution, trying to repeal, EPA has decided to allow the same amount of pollution as 66 million cars. That's one hell of a rule. That's one hell of a gift to polluters. And it's also really bad news for people who breathe, that is, all of us. The decision by the EPA to put forward this polluter-friendly rule is perfectly emblematic of the administration's approach to our environment and the Environmental Protection Agency's hostility to rules protecting the environment. We're going to have to rebrand the EPA, if it keeps this up, to be the Environment Polluting Agency. So how did we get here? It begins during the Biden administration, when an EPA that was concerned about our air quality standards moved to significantly reduce methane emissions from new and existing oil and gas operations under the Clean Air Act. And the EPA didn't just put out new standards and say, good luck. The agency used $1.55 billion in funding from the Inflation Reduction Act to help companies get into compliance with these new methane pollution standards. Having made that investment, this action by the Trump EPA makes even less sense. Before and during the formulation of EPA's methane standards in the last administration, several prominent oil and gas companies, including ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, BP, Occidental, Pioneer, Devon, acknowledged the need for federal standards for methane emissions. That's because leaking methane isn't profitable for companies. It's certainly not good PR. Methane, in fact, is a commodity that can be sold by these companies. Leaked methane represents billions of dollars in lost profits for the oil and gas industry, because methane is the main ingredient in natural gas. By halting our nation's methane standards, the Trump EPA will help the worst polluters, those who don't want to bother to control methane leaks and who therefore waste the very same energy resources that the Trump administration claims it wants to produce. What's more, companies already know how to stop methane leaks, and both the private and public sector have gotten really good at detecting leaks with advanced technology like satellite imagery. I'm very proud that California has been a national leader in using satellite imagery to protect the environment. In the face of federal environmental retreat, California launched its own satellite in March of this year to help detect and help stop methane leaks. And just this year, California has used that methane tracking satellite to close 10 large methane leaks. And I congratulate Governor Newsom for his innovative leadership on this. Many companies don't just acknowledge there should be a standard. They're already complying with the new standard and have been for almost an entire year. So to summarize, the Biden EPA promulgates new limits on methane emissions, provides $1.5 billion for companies to adapt to the new rules. Many major oil companies do adapt, and now the Trump administration wants to repeal these rules and let the oil and gas industry go back to polluting like they did in the not so good old days. it makes no sense. It makes no sense, that is, unless your real agenda is to attack climate science, to give industry free rein to pollute our air, and to pay back an industry that President Trump promised to reward if they gave $1 billion to his presidential campaign. Because EPA concluded 16 years ago that the agency legally had no choice but to regulate greenhouse gas pollution, because this pollution endangers the public health and the welfare of the American people. So let me say that again. EPA's own scientists closed the case on this 16 years ago. But this administration is obsessed with reversing the progress we have made and taking the country backwards. And this isn't just about greenhouse pollution, which fuels wildfires, supercharges hurricanes, floods communities, and kills crops that feed us. Cancer-causing benzene and volatile chemical compounds that form smog and choke our air are emitted alongside leaked methane pollution. If we all vote today for this resolution and restore EPA's smart methane standards, then we'll be voting to avoid up to 100,000 asthma attacks and to prevent premature deaths of Americans across the country. In addition to all the health and environmental concerns with the rule we're trying to repeal today, President Trump and Administrator Zeldin's EPA also failed to issue this rule in compliance with the law. EPA, as Senator Whitehouse made clear, neglected to solicit public comments and decided to move directly to a final rule violating both the Clean Air Act and the Administrative Procedures Act. Clearly, the Trump EPA does not want to hear from the American people. This isn't good policymaking. This is extreme ideological obsession with dire consequences for the health and welfare of the American people. So, Mr. President, this measure today will put every member of this body on record about how much methane we want released into the air. But it's also, I think, worth noting that my Republican colleagues have used the Congressional Review Act against Democratic states, like my home state of California, when they repealed our state's Clean Air Act rules. My Republican colleagues have used the CRA even when the parliamentarian and the Government Accountability Office said they could not legally do so. And my Republican colleagues have used the CRA against agency actions that have never been targeted before. So it's worth noting that we on the Democratic side are going to be making a list of a lot of the agency actions of this administration, because there will come a time when we're back in the majority. When that time comes, we will be advocating forcefully for the interests of communities all across the country, and we will not hesitate to use the CRA in the same way that our Republican colleagues are now using it. But instead of making America pollute again, we will make our air clean again, and we will make our water clean again. I urge senators to vote yes, and to continue the fight against dangerous and wasteful emissions of methane into our air.